This is my time.
Great things are happening at UNC Charlotte. Ranked among the top 100 public universities, Charlotte is on the rise. With over 30,000 students, championship athletics, and innovative academics, we're smashing records. Bringing amazing ideas to life with top-tier research. Great things are happening for the love of Charlotte.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Richard Buttermer. I'm the Dean of the Belk College of Business at UNC Charlotte, and I'd like to welcome you to the North Carolina Economic Forecast on this rainy and rather dreary day. So we appreciate you coming out, and we know we have a lot of people out there in cyberspace through the Zoom connection. We appreciate you being here as well. It's great to connect with the business community, our alumni and students in person as well as online. And before we get started, I'm pleased to recognize that we have former North Carolina State Representative and current member of the North Carolina Utilities Commission and Belk College alumnus, Bill Brawley, joining us here today. So thank you for being here today. We appreciate it. And I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the DuBois Center and the School of Professional Studies. UNC Charlotte School of Professional Studies, which is housed here in the DuBois Center, brings the university's intellectual resources to the heart of the Charlotte community. You can take advantage of more than 200 programs tailored to adult learners while you grow your uptown network. The DuBois Center at UNC Charlotte City Center is also the home base for the Belk College of Business graduate programs. We offer a variety of part and full-time programs for working professionals and executives, including our nationally ranked Charlotte MBA program, featuring both in-person and online options. In addition, this year, we have started offering undergraduate courses in business here at the DuBois Center. And in fact, as you wander through the building today, you may see up to 300 Belk College undergraduates roaming the halls. Now, to our presentation. We're going to have a question and answer period with our hybrid audience following today's presentation. So if you are online, please submit your questions via the Zoom chat at any time. They'll be relayed to me as we get started. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. John Connaughton, Professor of Economics in the Belk College. For over 40 years, John has been interpreting the data and sharing his experiences on where the North Carolina economy has been and where it's going next. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Connaughton.
Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Everybody good back there? All right, great. Well, this is welcome to our fourth quarter North Carolina Economic Forecast. And unlike the last 3.5 years, this one's going to be a little different. Things are changing, as we all know. And I was just talking to Mr. Brawley here, and I was indicating that my crystal ball is a little cloudier than it usually is going out right now. There are a lot of balls in the air, and I'm not exactly sure how things are going to turn out. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at what we think is going to happen most likely. Okay, so the program today, we'll talk about 2024 GDP and employment outlook. We're not quite done with the year yet, so we've got a little bit of forecast in that look. And then we're going to talk about 4 years of inflation and where we're going. And I think most of you probably caught the inflation number this morning. And quite frankly, it was a little disappointing. What will the Fed do going forward? And then I think on everybody's mind is tariffs and a trade war possibly taking place as Trump has indicated, 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico and 10% across the board China. He's already indicated that that's where he's going to start the negotiations from. And those are clearly our three largest trading partners. So, and then finally, we'll take a look at 2025, both GDP and employment. So let's take a look at 2024. You can see a couple of things here. The year started off pretty good. Overall, we're going to get about a 3.5% growth rate. But if you pay attention here, you notice that things are falling off in the last quarter, particularly 2%. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute or two, but the bottom line here is, believe it or not, a lot of that decline, this would have probably been 2.5%, but for Hurricane Helene. We've got a slide a little bit later on showing the impact of that on the state's economy. Devastating for the western part of the state, but that devastation is big enough to actually impact the overall state in the fourth quarter. Particularly from an employment standpoint as well. This is, and for those of you who first time here, let me spend a minute looking at this chart. This has got a lot of information on it, but basically what you have is on the horizontal axis, you have the growth rate for these sectors in the state. We've got 15 sectors in the state. The economy is broken down into that, and they all grow a little bit differently. And so this axis here tells us about how much those individual sectors are likely to grow by December by the end of this month. This vertical axis is sort of like a pie chart. Think of it as a pie chart. This should add up to 100, I hope. It tells you the percent of the overall state's economy that each of these sectors make up. What you get as a result of that is the size, the area of these rectangles here, which includes growth rate in percent of the overall state economy. The size of those rectangles gives you the importance that that state contributed to the overall growth rate. So the bigger the rectangle, the more it contributed to the overall growth rate. And you can see the big rectangle here is finance, insurance, and real estate, which is, from an output standpoint, the largest sector in our state, makes up over 20% of state GDP. Business and professional services is next with 15%. So these two together are well over a third of the state's economy. All right. So when we look at this, one of the strange things that's happened, because it's been down tremendously the last several years, is agriculture is up this year by 22%. It sounds like a lot. It's an incredibly small sector. It makes up less than 1% of the state's economy. 22% sounds great, but it's because 23 was so bad. This is just back to sort of normal for agriculture, but it doesn't really account for a lot of the state's economy. And the big one, again, is, of the sectors we pay attention to, is construction, retail, trade. These are all up an incredible amount this year. When we look at the job numbers for the year, overall growth is about 1.4%, 81,800 net jobs by the end of December compared to December of 23. Again, educational and health services lead the way, both in terms of percentage of jobs and the growth rate at 3.7%. Big rectangle here, big rectangle on hospitality and leisure, and a big rectangle on government. One of the things you might notice here, if we just go back, finance, insurance, and real estate, 21.5% of the state's economy, 6.2% of the jobs. So it's a high productivity sector, but it doesn't contribute a lot to the overall employment. This number, if you were here last month, or excuse me, a couple of months ago, on a third quarter before Hurricane Helene, that number was closer to about 95,000. And that's the impact that hurricane has had on the overall state, particularly on the employment side of things. All right, 4 years of inflation. We've all lived through it. We all know about it. Here is just what's been going on. This is the period where it was just, what would they call that? It was transitory, I think. Yeah. Did anybody catch Janet Yellen yesterday? Oh, she apologized for using that. She said, most people think of that as just being a couple, 3 months or something like that, not a year and a half, okay? They're walking a lot back, interesting, in the last month or so. But anyway, as you all know, by the middle of 22, it got up to 9.1% in terms of the overall CPI. That's the blue line here. And after rates got up to over 5%, the Fed funds rate got up to over 5%, we start to see a big decline in that. But what I want you to pay attention to is not the overall CPI. I want you to pay attention to the core CPI, which is the CPI less food and energy. That's the red line here, okay? And as you can see, it has been coming down. It didn't quite spike as much, but it's been coming down. It's been coming down slower. And in the last several months, what it's been doing, both of these are rising. Now, this one today came out this morning. The November CPI came out this morning, and the year over year went up from 2.6 to 2.7. That's what you see here. But the last 3 months for the core CPI has been stuck at 3.3%. And I think a number of economists are concerned about that, in the sense that the last mile you go is the toughest mile to get. And we want to get this thing down below 2%. That's what the Fed says. The problem, of course, is it gets very, very sticky. And what we don't know right now is whether or not what we have here is some stickiness that's going to be difficult to wring out to get back to 2%, or whether we actually have a little bit of a resurgence in inflation, and only time will tell. All right, we can see that, and again, this is a chart that starts at 16.5%, so it's kind of funny, but you can see that wages haven't kept up. They're about 2.5% behind where prices have gone over the last 3 years. But the biggest problem we have is that we have a lot of the sectors of the economy fighting the Fed. And that's really what the big problem is. The Fed tried to do the right thing. If you go back here and look at this, they were late coming to the party, but they got pretty aggressive pretty quickly. The problem here is that Congress and the president, with the deficit spending, what are we looking at? $2 trillion this year in deficit. It's, we always hear all-time high, but this is significantly above where we really ought to be looking at. It's about 6% of GDP, and the kind of rule of thumb on deficits is, 3% probably isn't going to get you in a lot of trouble. So if you run a deficit that's about 3%, i.e. if we were running a $1 trillion deficit now, I don't think anybody would be particularly concerned about it. But at $2 trillion, 6% of GDP, it becomes concerning. But not only is Congress and the president behaving badly and fighting the Fed, we are, okay? We are doing it as well. All of us are dealing with our bucket lists, right? How many of you here have taken a pretty significant trip or done some other kind of thing in the last year or two? And so we're all fighting the Fed as well. The stock market's fighting the Fed, labor unions and the labor market with strikes and increased, we've seen some incredible union settlements with UPS, with the car companies, with the airlines. These are all 30 to 40% over 5-6 year wage increases. So they're all fighting the Fed. And believe it or not, deficit spending, printing money to chase goods, all of that leads to inflation, but we also know that wages lead to inflation as well. All right, so here is the Biden administration spending, about $4.8 trillion over 10 years. Ugh. And here is kind of looking at our deficits. And the projection for this year is $1.9 trillion. I call it $2 trillion. It's pretty big. But the scary thing is the way things are going, the CBO is projecting that 10 years out, we'll be looking at almost $3 trillion. So in other words, this gets a little bit better in the short term, but in the long term, based on the current sets, and remember, these are 10 years, okay? So they have an impact on the out years going out like this in terms of their impact on the deficit. So a lot of this stuff is already in place. And all of that is inflationary. So this is the Fed balance sheet. This is what they did during COVID. As you can see in 2020, it ramped up considerably because they were buying all of the bonds that the federal government was issuing in order to increase that spending that I just showed you. And now they're starting to wind that down, but they still don't have a lot of leeway if we were to slide into another recession. And I'm not suggesting that we are, but if we were, they're sort of out of a lot of degrees of freedom, if you will, or ability to do something in a big way should we slide again with almost a $7 trillion balance sheet. Okay, personal consumption expenditures, this is the dip we saw during, it wasn't that big a dip, but this was the dip. And they're just going up and up and up, and now they're almost $20 trillion. The Dow Jones, we know that, there's the dip, and then it's just been growing pretty steadily since then. Okay, so the big issue then is in 2025, what the Fed's going to do. Now they're meeting again next week. Yeah, next week. They've already had 2 decreases or reductions in the Fed funds rate, a 50 basis point reduction a few months ago, and then last month it was a 25 basis point reduction. The betting is they're going to do another 25 basis points. I want to caution you when you look at what's going on when the market is betting on these, because they're betting on what they're likely to do, not what they ought to do, and there's a big difference between that. Okay, so it's not like the market is saying, well, they should be cutting 25 basis points in a week. No, that's the bet that's going to take place, not what it is they should do. Based on the employment numbers we got last Friday, and based on the inflation numbers we got today, it suggests to me that 25 base, any kind of cut in the near term is probably not warranted. But anyway, this is a look at that. The question becomes, has disinflation, and again, just want to be clear about this. There's a difference between prices coming down, or the rate of inflation coming down, and actually prices coming down. So what we're seeing, what we're experiencing is disinflation, which is the rate of price increases coming down from the high of 9%, now down to 3.3% for the core and 2.7% overall. So that is disinflation. We've not seen any deflation where actually prices have reduced. Now, in some sectors we had, and a lot of the decline we saw in the CPI in the last month or two, 2 or 3 months, has been energy prices, which have been coming down, actually have been deflating. But that's really the only component of the CPI of all the goods, the 400 goods that are in there. That's the only component that has actually been coming down in price. Everything else is just not rising as fast as it has been rising in terms of prices. And the big question is inflation returning? Fed has a dual mandate, and I think a lot of you know that, and that is to promote maximum employment and stable prices. That's their charge. Look, anybody can do one or the other. It's pretty easy. If you don't care what inflation is, you can juice up the economy and get employment going crazy. On the other hand, if you don't care what happens to employment, you can get inflation down below 2% easily. The problem is that balancing act between two competing or trade-off objectives. So here we have the monthly jobs. These are 227,000 last month in November for the U.S. monthly job growth. And as you can see, if you kind of run it through here, the average has been, with the exception of October, and we'll talk a little bit about what happened in October, but when you have two hurricanes in Florida and one in North Carolina and Tennessee, it has an impact on jobs, and I think that's what this number is. But when you take a look at the average here, we're running out about 150,000 jobs, which is pretty close to 2 million a year, which is pretty normal, okay? So that's what happened here. I told you that we have some interesting things about North Carolina. Take a look at our October. We don't have the November number in for North Carolina, but take a look at the states overall. Down by 5,500. That's 5,500 jobs down in October compared to the November number. And if you look through this thing, we average about 6,000 or 7,000 jobs a month, okay? So when you take what we should have seen on an average, which is 6,000 or 7,000 more jobs, but we actually went down by 5,500, the overall impact for the state level was somewhere 12,500, 13,000 jobs that were lost principally as a result of the hurricane having come through and the devastation that it created. So yeah, we all look at it, particularly down here in Charlotte, it's kind of, oh, bless their hearts, look at what's happened up there. A lot of us didn't go up to see the leaves this fall and enjoy outdoor activities up there. But I don't think we ever thought it was going to have an overall impact on the state, but it has had a significant impact on the state's economy. Okay, so here's the thing that nobody wants to talk about. There's an 800-pound gorilla. Okay, look, we all know the Fed's likely to drop rates this month, okay? We also know that there's probably another 75 basis points that they're going to drop in the first half of the year. And yet I showed you a slide that suggests that, you know what? They've kind of stalled on inflation. Because the key to look at is the core. The overall CPI has come down just because of energy. All right? But, food's still rising at more than 3% a year. A lot of other things are rising at more than 3% a year. I think I probably won't get this number exactly right because I looked at it real quickly this morning. But at-home food was up tremendously this month, like 4.5%. That component, which is supermarket prices, okay? But there's this 800-pound gorilla that nobody talks about. So everybody here knows what happened to Silicon Valley Bank, right? They thought they had an influx of deposits as a result of COVID and all the money that people were saving and getting checks mailed to them. They had this big set of deposits. They said, well, let's do the safe thing. Let's buy U.S. Treasuries. And so, and my dean is chuckling. So they bought U.S. Treasuries. The problem is that when the inflation hit and the Fed started to increase rates in 22, what's happening is they're holding Treasuries that are paying out 2%, right? All right. But new treasuries are paying out 4.5%. If they want to turn in or sell those treasuries in the secondary market in order to get money for the depositors to take out now that they're all out spending, they sell those bonds at a discount. They don't get the $10,000 that they paid for the bond. They get $9,200, $8,700, something like that, because that price that the new person pays for that bond's got to, the coupon rate's got to equivocate to 4.5%. Okay, and that's the problem. Well, guess who else is in that same problem? The Federal Reserve. They adopted a new policy as a result of the Great Recession. And I used to have this slide that in 2016, Janet Yellen, who's then chair of the Fed, gave this speech in Jackson Hole and basically endorsed this new policy of essentially enticing banks to put deposits at the Fed, and the Fed would pay them a 25 basis point premium over the federal funds rate. So now banks have done that. Tremendous amount of deposits at the Fed. When the federal funds rate was 5.25%, they're paying 5.5%. However, they had bought bonds that when their balance sheet went up from 4 or 5 trillion after the Great Recession up to 9 trillion, that was all these bonds that the Fed, the Congress, and President were were issuing in order to support all of the programs that they were providing for relief in the pandemic, and they bought those bonds at 1.5%, 2%. So now they're just like Silicon Valley Bank. They're upside down. And as a result of that, the Fed normally, in a normal year, hands back about 110, 109 billion in operating budget to the federal government. They are a self-supporting operation. They usually make money. They hand back any profits to the federal treasury. But right now, they're upside down. In 2022, they did 76 billion, but right now they're upside down because they lost 58 billion in 22. They lost 114 billion in 23. We don't know yet how much they've lost this year because they're having to pay higher rate out for the interest on the reserves than they are receiving for the treasuries they own. They, every single year, every single month, are losing money for the first time in their over 100-year history. Okay? So, some analysts see the net loss peaking at about 200 billion. Here's the problem. This slide's a little out of place, but this is just an indication from the San Francisco Fed does this inflation dispersion index. And basically what they're looking at is the fraction of expenditures in the CPI basket whose prices have gone down in the month and the fraction have increased. And we have a year's worth here. And we see that, yeah, in general, we've seen an increase in those categories with prices declining. But we still have 80% or more of the categories with price increases. So we really haven't done a lot to curb inflation. And the problem is, and this is that same chart again, we're seeing some stickiness here. And we've got the December 17th, 18th meeting next week where I think they've already almost identified that they're going to do a 25 basis point cut. I would bet that in the first 3 meetings of 25 that you're going to see at least 2 of those with cuts already baked in. Powell has as much as given us forward guidance with that. Why are they doing it? Because lower rates increase the likelihood of a soft landing. But the big thing is it reduces Fed losses. They're losing money. They can't continue to go on losing money. They're borrowing from the Treasury, and you know how the government works. Oh yeah, write your little IOU, we'll put it in our pocket, and hopefully it'll all work out. But they increase inflation risks going forward. So what they can do is they can keep rates at current levels. That will control inflation, increases the possibility of recession, but it increases Fed losses. That's what you have to know in order to understand what the heck it is Powell is doing right now. All right. Tariffs and a trade war. I got to do this real quick. All right. So tariffs. This is the biggest. This morning I watched CNBC, Squawk Box. Yeah, I get my 8:30. Rick Santelli comes on and gives us his hit on what the CPI did and all that. And but the bottom line is, when they talk about trade and tariffs on that, they don't have a clue how tariffs work. These are professionals, allegedly, and they don't have a clue how tariffs work. Everybody thinks it's a sales tax. It's not even close to that. Tariffs are not imposed on the final retail price the way sales tax is. They're also not imposed on the wholesale price. They are, it is basically what is known in the jargon of the trade world, the last sale. So this is basically what the export agent paid the factory for the product. So in the case of a Chinese toaster that you see at Target, that's like say $60, that may be the final retail price that you pay at Target, but the Chinese exporter paid the Chinese factory maybe $20 for that. And that the tariff is imposed on that, not on 60. So it's not $6 that the tariff gets, it's $2. Okay? Yeah, that's going to add to the price, no argument there, but it's not like a sales tax. So two things about it. One is it's not as inflationary as the critics are suggesting. It also doesn't raise as much revenue as some people think it might raise. Okay, so we got that basically what I just said. But the bottom line is it comes through with $2 more to the retailer at some point in time through the wholesale process in the United States. But we all know that supply and demand have elasticities. They're not straight curves, they're like this. And so some of it winds up being on the producer, and some of it winds up on the consumer. So if the total tariff's $1.50, consumers may only pay $1.70 on it, $1.75 on it. That may be and it's a one-time impact. The toaster is $61.50, and that's it, one time, and that's the way it is going forward. So it's not as much of a problem as it's been made out to be, as far as the critics are suggesting. Okay, so who wins and who loses in a trade war? We buy about $600 billion from China every year. China buys about $200 billion from us. So even at 25% on all Chinese imports, that's even bigger than what Trump's talking about, we will not approach the gross margins of $150 billion. It's probably more like $50 billion by the time it works its way through. And that's less than 0.4% of total consumer spending last year. So it sounds bad. It sounds like everything's going to cost 25% more, but it really is a lot less than that. It just doesn't all come through to the end consumers. All right. So let's take a look at 2025 and get out of here and take some questions. Growth is going to be a little less next year for a couple of reasons, but the big reason is that we just had a fantastic year this year with 3.5% growth in the state. U.S. is probably growing north of 3%. Expectations are, regardless of what takes place in terms of changes in regulations going forward or any other issues, 2025 is just going to have a devil of a time repeating what happened in 2024. Okay, our long-term growth outlook historically has been at about 2%. So 2.3% is pretty good here. Okay. On a sector basis, we expect a lot less volatility in the sectors this year than we had last year. So most of them are going to be growing close to 2% or right around that. The exceptions, of course, are information and a little bit in terms of construction. And then in terms of jobs, fewer jobs this year, in 25 than we saw in 2024. But again, the same kinds of sectors. Information is going to be a big one again with growth there. Business and professional services and hospitality and leisure services are all going to grow at a little bit better than 1%. Okay. Now, as far as unemployment is concerned, this is the state unemployment rate. We only have the October's the latest we have. This is the U.S. rate. U.S. is up to 4.2%. We're still down at 3.7%, but I expect that November number as a result of what happened out in the western part of the state. I expect that November number to jump up about 0.2%. But by the end of 2025, we'll still be just a little over 4%, 4.2%. We're not sure what the benchmark or natural rate of unemployment is. We used to think it was 4, then at some points in time we thought it was more than 4, but somewhere between 4 and 4.5 is typically what you see as in the literature as to what the benchmark rate or the natural rate of unemployment is. So we'll still be looking at that in the state. So from an employment standpoint and an unemployment standpoint, things look pretty good in 2025. All right, real quickly, keys to watch: Fed rate cuts. Are they going to go on this process of continuing to cut rates and probably get stalled at 3.5% rates of inflation? We always have the energy price wild card. I told you that it's brought the overall CPI down in the last 3 months. How long that lasts, it's anybody's guess. U.S. monthly job growth comes out the first Friday of the month. You can get an alert and your phone will buzz at 8:30 in the morning on Friday, and you can look and see what it is, see how many jobs were created, and see what the unemployment rate is. The December inflation rate comes out January 15th, so that'll be the next CPI that we get. The FOMC meeting is next week. We'll see what the Fed decides to do. Also, we are in a continuing resolution on the budget, but there's going to be some additions to it that are likely to get passed before the 20th, because that's when the government shuts down. So somewhere between now and the 20th, we're going to get another push for the continuation budget for the fiscal year 25. The problem is they're looking at what, 20 to 30 billion in increases over above what the continuation is in new spending. And then finally, the fourth quarter GDP will come out on January 30th of 2025. That'll be the fourth quarter for 24. So key takeaways: exogenous shocks matter, particularly things like hurricanes, particularly things like energy prices. These all matter in terms of what happens in the economy. Fed policy obviously matters, and they have a dual mandate, but my suspicion is they also have a third problem that they're looking at. Okay? We suspect there'll be a 50-50 return of inflation in 2025. I know that's not comforting, but I don't think the Fed is going to behave with inflation, with inflation as job one. I think they've got other objectives that they're looking at, particularly not losing money for a third year in a row. The wealth effect on stock market will continue to allow consumers to fight the Fed. All right. When I say a 20/80 chance of recession occurring in 25, you got to understand from an economist's standpoint, that's virtually zero. Okay. But we can't say it's not going to happen. All right. So we just put, kind of see, a year from now, you say, hey, you said there was going to be a recession. Well, I said there was a 20% chance that we'd come back. So that's kind of hedging my bets, okay? But I really don't see, given what's happened in the last month since Trump was elected, and I really don't see a return of a recession or the possibility of a recession in 2025. And it looks like, and this is always a big thing, and I didn't mention this in the presentation, the Trump tax cuts from 2017 expire at the end of 25. But it looks like that's not going to happen. So going forward, that will be a big bonus or a big plus for the economy in 2025. All right, that takes care of it. All right, thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. I think Richard's going to handle the question and answer period.
Yes, I get to moderate the questions, so
okay.
I get to
make
do that.
My life miserable.
We'll start and ask if there's anybody in the room who has a question. I'd be happy to take that now. Somebody in the back there.
Hey, thank you. What economic impacts might you anticipate if the mass deportations actually becomes a thing?
Yeah, we were talking about that when I was grabbing a bite to eat before. I think I'm probably speaking out of turn here, but I think a large number of people, certainly the American public, has suggested that if you enter the country illegally, you should be subject to deportation. I think there was about 60% of America in a poll recently suggested that. The problem is that a lot of our economy relies on illegal immigrants providing services and job skills. And so it's not as simple as it seems to be. I think that hopefully they will go after all the bad guys and a lot that aren't contributing to the overall economy. But if they start, pulling out what essentially are contractors, particularly in the trades, building trades, and some other areas, food processing, pulling people out of that, I think that potentially we could see some problems. They might wind up deporting maybe the wrong people as opposed to maybe those people that are a drag on our economy. They may start deporting some. So this is a very complex question. It's like everything else. It's like tariffs. It's just not simple. It's complex. So there is a downside possibility to give a direct answer to your question.
So I'm going to take a question that we have from Zoom land. And that question is, should we think of wholesale trade as the sector that would be most impacted by a trade war?
Not really. Wholesale trade just is a sort of a pass-through. Yep. At the end of the day, it's what the price is on the shelves of Target or Walmart or Amazon. The wholesale just passes that through. When you do the supply and demand and you look at the elasticities, okay, impact is on consumers, but not fully. And the impact is going to be more than likely on manufacturers, okay? So that's really where those impacts are going to fall. Most everybody else, the exporter in China, the importer in the United States, the wholesale distribution network, they're all pretty much going to pass through whatever happens. It's where the rubber meets the road when consumers and retail make decisions on what that price will be, who will absorb what percentage of that price increase that the wholesaler presented to the retailer, and also back at the beginning of the chain, what the exporter is willing to pay the Chinese factory, or this could be the Canadian or Mexican factory for those products. And as far as, I got to throw this out. So, with both of those countries, both Canada and Mexico, one of the big products that we import from them is energy, oil. And one of the biggest problems there is there's not the markup over the price of a barrel of oil to what you pay at the pump. Most of the markup is honestly in taxes, federal and state and local taxes on the price of a gallon of gasoline. So you're likely to see much more of that pass through than almost any other product. And the other thing is, just as a kind of a warning to everybody out there, all right, if your big screen TV is not quite the one you want, okay, you got a 55-inch and you really want a 65, or, you're getting a little dots here and there on it from time to time, like the thing, now's the time to buy a big screen TV, because virtually all of the big screen TVs that we consume in this country are, guess where they're made? In Mexico, okay? Yeah. So Sony, Samsung, all those companies, the factories are down there. Ask me how I know, Richard.
How do you know, John?
Because when I used to teach in our MBA program down in Monterey, you used to drive by the factories on the way from the airport to downtown.
Indeed.
So there you go.
For those of you who don't know, we have a joint MBA program with Tecta Monterey in Monterey, Mexico. We've had it for about 20 years, and we have about 70 students a year go through that program. It's actually a very, very big program for us, and we're very excited about that.
Yeah.
So do we have another question from the audience? Yeah, right here.
The current debt is $36 trillion. Why is it we don't talk about it? Economists don't talk about it. The president doesn't talk about it. Congress doesn't talk about it. So we just ignore it? I mean, I realize it's a big picture, and of course now with the tax cut, that's not going to help because more money is going to not come back in. So is there a good reason, or should we just forget about the debt and just say, it may happen, but we'll just keep printing money?
Okay, so it's a good question, all right? And $36 trillion, and it sounds like a number, right? Really what we need to look at is not the absolute size, but the size of the debt relative to GDP. So we're running now about 128%, something along those lines, maybe close to 130% of our GDP is our debt size. And so, and if we were to take a snapshot of this 10 years ago, okay, or a little bit longer than that, just before the Great Recession, it would be in the 60s. So we've almost doubled the size of our debt in proportion to our GDP over the last 15 years. Okay, so that kind of puts it all in perspective. But don't worry about the 36 trillion, I worry about the 130%. However, while that seems like a shocking number, okay, it's not the highest in the world. Anybody care to guess who the highest one is in terms of percent? It's over 200%. Anybody want to get? Japan. Okay. So, I mean, economies can survive with what you and I would probably consider obscene levels of debt. Okay. However, the real problem with the size of the debt is the interest payment out of our budget. And at our current sets of interest rate, and this may be part of the reason, again, an additional reason why the Fed is dropping rates, okay? And that is to make it a little easier for the fiscal policy to handle the debt payment, all right, on the outstanding debt that we have. Because at the current rates of refinance in the 4.5% range, it won't be long before the debt service is the largest single item in our federal budget. And therein lies the problem. It's not so much the size of the debt that's the issue, it's what we in the economist business call the opportunity cost. You know, if we're paying, $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion to service the debt, that's $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion of stuff we couldn't otherwise provide, like better schools, better military, et cetera. So it's the opportunity cost, what gets carved out of other programs and other things the government does in order to service that debt. Now, if the Fed brings rates down, doesn't worry too much about inflation, two things happen. One is nominal GDP rises and makes the deficit less as a percent, and interest rates are lower, and so the debt service price or cost is lower. Now, that's kind of the cynical view of what's going on right now, but you can see how this is all related.
Yeah, and the other thing that I'd just add to that is I think a lot of times we don't talk about the debt as much as we talk about the deficit, because the deficit's the marginal thing we kind of control, right? The debt's kind of there. We've already taken on that debt. The deficit is what drives the addition to that debt. And so I think you tend to see policymakers and politicians and journalists and economists talk about the deficit because it's the marginal component that we can actually still do something with.
And in that light, you talked about 36 trillion. I told you deficit this year is going to be 2 trillion. A year from now when we're here, what's the debt going to be? Thank you.
Yep.
You get an A. This is the grading period. I got my last grades in this morning, so this is the grading period.
You're ready to do another one. I
Yeah.
get it. Let me take one more from the Zoom world, and that is a question of which economic sectors or types of jobs might have been the most hurt by Hurricane Helene. How will that continue to affect the state's CPI?
Okay, so again, you have to understand where this hit, because it hit in the mountains, and that's a recreation area. So a lot of tourist jobs, leisure, hospitality jobs, they got hammered. Places are starting to open up. Restaurants are starting to open up. Hotels are starting to open up. In a lot of instances, early on when they opened up, restaurants were just serving the recovery workers who were there, putting the lines back up, cleaning up the streets and stuff. It's predominantly that. A number of manufacturing firms and a number of other types of medical firms and stuff like that were pretty much up and running in a couple of weeks at full capacity if their buildings weren't destroyed but just damaged. But hospitality has been the real industry that's been hit. Hotels, restaurants, et cetera. Yes, sir.
We have a funding deadline coming up.
Yes.
Shut down the government, and then compounding on that, we will eventually get another debt ceiling vote. And then more recently, you hear about the possible politicization, if I'm saying it right, of the Fed. What impact would those things have?
Now, Mr. Good News down here in front. Okay, so we've got, I think December 20th is the current continuing resolution comes to an end. And so, again, because we've got split Congress, Senate goes one way, House goes the other, we did not get a budget by October 1st of 2024, which is the 25 fiscal year. And so they just passed these short-term continuing resolutions in hopes of creating a budget for the fiscal year. They will not create a budget for the fiscal year, but the chances are fairly good that a continuing budget will happen on the 20th or by the 20th. I think the House is going to pass it. As I mentioned earlier, and I may not have the numbers exactly right, but there are add-ons to the continuing resolution that have some things to do with hurricane aid, military, et cetera. They're going to add $25 billion to the continuing resolution over the next 3 to 4 months. I don't know how long they're going to pass it, but typically it's usually 3 months. So we're going to go through this again in March, all right? And so, you know, that's and the second part of your question?
The debt ceiling?
Oh, the debt ceiling. That doesn't actually crop up for several months. So, I mean, we don't do anything in this country till it's absolutely necessary to do it.
And the final one was, any loss of view of independence of the Fed?
You know, the question I'm going to ask is this, and you know, look, I am not a Jerome Powell fan. Let's put it that way. I don't think he's done a particularly good job in the 5.5, 6 years that he's been in office, for a variety of reasons. And while I theoretically believe in the independence of the Fed, I have certainly not seen them being particularly independent over the last half a dozen years. This is not Alan Greenspan's Fed, all right? I mean, we went through a year of denial of transitory inflation. Anybody want to know why? Anybody? It's worse than that. Jerome Powell's term as chair was up in May of 22. He wanted to be reappointed. He didn't raise rates until after May of 22, despite the fact that inflation was 9% by then. So this whole idea of Fed independence sounds good up here in the clouds, but in practicality, it's not all that real. Oh,
I guess with advancements in AI and automation, how do you think that's going to affect certain industries? I know like Charlotte is heavily concentrated in financial and business services, but do you see that affecting the labor market, whether it's locally or nationally?
okay, everybody hear that question? AI's impact on the labor market, whether it's the finance industry or any other industry. I'm going to tell a little bit of a story. Is that okay? I got time? Yeah, I got plenty of time. So I called my dermatologist. Oh, no, I didn't. I went to call my dermatologist to get my 6-month appointment. And sometime between the time that I last made an appointment and yesterday, they no longer have a phone number. Okay? Like everybody else in this world, and this used to be a tagline for a bank in town, if you can't do it online, you can't do it. Okay? That one of the big banks uptown, the employees used to joke about that. And as a result of that, I had to fill out a request. But unlike what you typically see, which is you got a portal, you go to it, and you can pick out your doctor and your times that are available. No, they're going to call you back. I don't understand the logic behind that. Okay, even though my phone's on silent right now, I still haven't gotten a call back 24 hours later. So I don't know what's going to happen there. My point is this. We think of AI as this magical thing that's going to do a lot of things for us. But if you look at how computer interfaces work today, they're pretty sketchy. Some things work pretty good. Hey, if you want to order something from Amazon, click, 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 it's here, right? But if you try that with some others, could get real sketchy real quick, okay? So, you know, it's not as smooth as you think it is, and it's probably not going to be that smooth for quite some time. And more importantly, and my big concern with AI is sort of the same concern I had with EVs, and that is electric power generation. Okay? We know the power consumption that the server farms require, and we just don't have that capacity in our grid these days. So there are going to be limits as to how much AI can do in the near future. So I'm not real worried about it. And I'll throw in one final thing, okay, to make you very, very simple. I think it was Joseph Schumpeter that said that capitalism is creative destruction. And we've been going through that in technology for the last 150 years. And everybody thinks every time there's a new technological advancement, because it's going to eliminate thousands of jobs that, oh my God, where are people going to work? Okay? Well, that hasn't happened yet. I think the unemployment rate in this state was 3.7%, despite all the technological advances that's happened in the last couple of hundred years. And I'm always reminded that there are a hell of a lot more auto mechanics these days than there ever were blacksmiths. There's a drum roll somewhere. Thank you.
I'm a little reminded, that question kind of reminds me, I think a lot of the impact of AI, even when we see it at the individual level, it's going to take a little while to really show up in kind of the large-scale productivity measures. I don't know if you remember this, John, you would remember it, but back in the 90s, I remember reading people saying, hey, we've had this great revolution and the internet's out, you get these websites, but it wasn't showing up in productivity numbers. As late as 2005, there's a bit of a mystery. Where's the productivity gains? Well, it turns out they were there. It just took time to come through. And today, of course, we see those productivity gains massively with e-commerce and other things. I have a suspicion it's going to be somewhat similar with AI.
Yeah, it's going to take a while.
That the real large-scale economic benefits will take a few years to show up in the thing. So anyway, I want to follow up on that because we got a Zoom question that's directly related. Do you include AI impact in your job calculations?
No.
Okay, easy enough.
That's it.
Not
That was
yet.
an easy one.
It's too early. All right, so we'll do one more from the Zoom world, and I think we'll have to stop. And that question is, some people are waiting to buy a house to see if a 30-year fixed-rate mortgages will go back to the 2 to 3% range. What are the odds for that? And I'm going to tell you, I will also say I'll give you Dr. Chu's response to that same question when we did our state of housing report about a month ago. But
Okay,
John,
so you're saying back to people will be able to get 3% 30-year fixed
will they?
mortgages.
What are the odds of
What are
going
the
back
odds
to
of
2
that?
to 3%?
It's what we call in my business the chance brothers, slim and none.
That was exactly what Dr. Chu said. In fact, he actually said it will never happen again in our lifetimes. And I
Well,
think
certainly in mine, but I'm old. But
He's younger
some
than
of you,
me,
I'm looking
so,
at some
yeah.
youngsters around here. Maybe you'll see it again. But interesting, Richard. We saw those rates at 3%, some
Yep.
2.7, 2.6 something. Those harken back to the last time we saw rates that low was in the 50s.
Yep.
So that was what 60 some odd years ago. So potentially we're looking
70.
for that length of time. Let me finish that question up. There's a big discussion going on right now in terms of something, this is one of those esoteric economist terms, called a neutral rate, all right? And that is, what do we think the rate of interest is that will be non-inflationary and non-contractionary? Where is that rate? Fed has no clue where it is, by the way. I'll just put it to you that way. They even admit that they don't know where it is. And so they're going to be searching for it. But some economists have made some shots at it, and they think that the Fed funds rate, the neutral rate, may be somewhere close to 4%. Well, if that short-term overnight rate's 4%, you can figure what the market rate for a 30-year mortgage is going to be. It's going to be higher than that somewhere. So are we going to get away from, if we get a handle on inflation, are we going to get away from 7% 30-year fixed, maybe down to 5%? Probably in the next couple of years, sure. And that's a rate you can live with, okay? It's not as good as... my son's got like a 2.7, never mind. So anyway, yeah, slim and none.
Slim and none. I agree with you on that. So we'll take one more question. We'll do it from here in the audience unless nobody has any. Then I've got
We got one way back there.
You'll have the last question.
Well, I can just talk real quick. You've heard a lot, we all know that the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency for most of the world. We've heard a lot of information from the incoming administration that they want to go big in crypto. What is your, I wouldn't say your feeling in crypto, but what is your feeling about crypto potentially becoming a mainstream currency of international trade, and how would it affect the dollar and, our position is in that regard?
Well, let's understand how international trade and exchanges take place. It basically takes place between banks, okay? And banks like dollars. It's just that simple. Currency that's stable, and there's no particular risk in doing trades in dollars between countries. I I've got to be honest with you. I don't fully understand the crypto, what's the word, attraction. I think it's predominantly speculative. If you look at an asset who, since Trump has got elected, has gone up, what, 20-something%?
Yep.
I mean, do you want to get involved in trading in that environment where you trade at one price and then by the time you need to get rid of it and convert it to something else, it's worth 10%, 20% less? I mean, it is quite speculative. And so I'm not sure until it becomes a hell of a lot more stable. I mean, a lot of crypto advocates are saying, hey, by this time next year, crypto's going to be 200, or $200,000 a bit, yeah, as opposed to the, what, 90-something it is now? Do you really want to run your business in that risk environment versus dollar, which has been, what, pretty damn stable over the last, what,
Yeah, it'd be a
100
real
years?
problem if you were if you're an importer and you were willing to enter to a contract to buy product 6 months from now, and you were doing it in crypto, because you would have no idea what economic value you had to deliver in 6 months to get the product.
Earlier this year, wasn't it as low as 60?
Yeah, it's been in the 50s.
It's been in the 50s this year alone. How can you run a business that way? Not for long. So I'm not worried about it. A little bit more worried about the impact that BRICS might have on it in certain parts of the world. But in terms of replacing the dollar as a reserve currency, not particularly worried about it. All right, guys, thank you very, very much. We'll be back here, what, in February?
Yep.
Back here
So
in February doing a joint program with the Charlotte Business Journal. And so y'all take care. And by and large, 2025, thumbs up. No recession.
thank you, John. We appreciate it. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here today. If you or your firm would like to further engage with the Belk College, it's our mission to produce the talent, expertise, and impactful research that fuels the economic growth of the Charlotte region. Please reach out to me, to John, and to others. We're here to serve you. So thank you for being here today. This concludes the program, and we'll see you in a few weeks, and have a great holiday period.